I'm now live. Can you hear me, JC?
I can.
Awesome. You sound good as well. Great. Thanks a lot, Orly, for that intro. That was a great session. We'll roll ahead right now into our next session. So for those that are just joining, welcome to PreVeil's CMMC Summit. For those who've been watching some of the earlier sessions, I think this one will be good as well. So with me today is JC Dodson from BAE Systems. Welcome, JC.
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are.
Exactly. We're spread out. We're spread out all over. It doesn't matter. This session is going to cover a DoD Prime's view on expectations for their supply base when it comes to data security and DFARS NIST CMMC compliance. JC Dodson is Vice President and Chief Security Officer for BAE Systems, Inc. He is responsible for corporate security strategy, operations, and assurance. His risk management portfolio includes all elements of the industrial, international, and cybersecurity for U.S. and overseas operations. JC leads operational oversight of the corporation's special security agreement with the U.S. government and is a principal advisor to the Corporate Board of Directors Government Security Committee. So again, JC, thanks for joining us. I know we've worked together for a couple of years now and talked quite a bit about regulatory compliance at BAE Systems and the importance of ensuring secure and compliant sharing of controlled and classified information, or CUI, and export control data like ITAR with your direct suppliers. We've also discussed the importance of data security and compliance as controlled data flows down your entire supply chain. I know that we have many tier 2 and tier 3 contractors in the audience today, and they're probably interested in the expectations of a tier 1 customer like BAE. So first of all, can you share your thoughts on your views of the recent convergence of data security and mandatory compliance within the DoD supply chain?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Vince. And apologize, I got a little gravelly voice here, so I'll try and keep my voice intact. It's been interesting. When we started out some years back, it was really about defending the network, right? It was all about perimeter defenses and then working our way inbound and hardening up the inside. And then we saw some events occur over the last couple of years, in particular, where the customer themselves was starting to drive more requirements coming into our networks and insisting that even though it's unclassified data, it is government data, and they want to protect it in a different way. And that evolved, of course, into the DFARS and the 800-171 that we know well. And then again, that's evolved into the CMMC journey that we're on right now. So we've seen this evolution from what I would say operational security needs, where we went to best practices and did our own thing because it made sense to protect our network, now to a more regulatory-based regime. So I think one of the things aerospace and defense sector has seen is an increase in regulatory requirements, much like the financial sector saw probably a decade ahead of us. So we got two things going on. We've got regulatory requirements that are on the increase. We're seeing U.S. government incident reporting requirements are coming in. Of course, if you're a DoD contractor, you have one set of elements, but we also understand DHS and other sectors and other agencies are starting to put their own unique requirements on, including the FTC and so forth. So we're trying to get one set of controls that works for the industry to include reporting. We're also seeing a increased presence in legislative initiatives that are coming through, particularly on the appropriators and authorizers side on the defense acts. Within a lot of the new laws that are coming out, new bills, there seem to be an increase in the number of things that are happening around cybersecurity, reporting, intelligence sharing, and responsiveness to the suppliers relative to the defense industrial base. So we're seeing a large confluence of all these coming in, somewhat at the same time. Again, we've had operational controls, now they're being overlaid with regulatory controls. In a perfect world, those two control sets would line right up on each other. So everything we're doing regulatory supports our operational needs. The reality is that we don't have quite a perfect match. And so as suppliers and providers in this regime, we have to have basically two mindsets. What is the operational controls that we need? then what are those regulatory compliant controls we need, and how do we put those both together into a solid cyber program?
Very good. Thank you. From your overall perspective and that of BAE, tell us a little bit more about the urgency of the situation of ensuring this security and compliance across the chain. How vulnerable is your view, in your view, is the DoD supply chain? And what is your impression on the growing volume of, incidents in the supply chain? How are you guys tracking that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Vince, because we have now, over the last 2 years in particular, seen a significant increase in supplier incidents. We as a larger prime and a pretty solid set of network defenses are still seeing attacks on us, but they're not at the same level of they were a couple of years ago. And what we were finding as those of our peers that are large primes, and we do compare notes, we work together on projects, and particularly when there's activity going on, we share a lot of capabilities through various capacities that we have. And we are all seeing the phenomena where if they can't get on our doors, they are going after our suppliers that have our data. And so we have seen a significant shift down into small and mid-sized suppliers that have our program data. We've seen an increase over 100% last year, another increase 100% this year. So there's two reasons for that. One is there's truly more attacks going on, but we are also gaining better insight from our suppliers when they have had a problem, that they're letting us go, and letting us know what we're doing. I think another thing that's important, we do a lot of stuff on our data with our insurance companies and look to see what's going on in the overall market. And just they've reported an 82% increase in ransomware attacks from 20 to 2021, and they're seeing the same rate at the same pace going into 2022. So ransomware is an incredible increase. And of course, then that's manifested itself in insurance premiums that are anywhere from 100 to 300% increases over the last couple of years. I think the other thing that is not surprising, but it is concerning, is that IBM puts out a really good report every year on the cost of data breaches. It's a good piece of work, and it helps. It's a good read for those of us in the profession, but it does allow us to benchmark and get some ideas about what happens after a breach. And right now in 2020, it was about $4.2 million per breach. Already in 2021, they decided, based on their data, and have discovered that it's 5.72 million per breach. So that's going in the wrong direction. So we've got, more tax, ransomware is up, cost of the breach is going up. And we're saying I would say just from a tactic standpoint, we're seeing a lot more social engineering attacks. For example, they'll go after a patent search, right? Patents are public. They'll figure out who owns the patent. They'll decide who that great mind that put the patent is together. They'll search where that person works, and then they'll send some very wildly crafted emails to that company in an attempt to entice the patent holder to click on the link, and then all of a sudden people are off to the races in a bad way. So phishing is very much on the increase. And the other thing that we're seeing is a longer dwell time by the attackers. So when the ransomware attempt is made, it used to be kind of a come in, come out, pay the money, lose the data, get it locked. Now there seem to be almost multiple steps in some of these complex ransomware attacks where they will come in, demand a certain amount of money, potentially release some data, then they'll come back with another run at it to get some more money, more release of data, and you can see the dwell time and the inability to get the actor out of the network without extracting some harm to our data or the target company's data is starting to increase. So overall, it's getting harder and more expensive than it used to be a little bit ago.
Interesting. I'm very interesting the way they used to try to find the cracks at BAE Systems. Now they're saying, hey, I can get some of that same information at easier targets down the supply chain.
Absolutely. We're seeing it. We're seeing it in the data. We're seeing it in the data that we track both last year and this year on the increase.
Wow. It makes it so much more important that the same type of security controls that you put in place as a prime get used, as much as possible, as that data flows down through the chain. Yeah, agreed. Okay, so one interesting thing here is that there's certainly nation state kind of attacks trying to procure this information from folks, but even just standard ransomware attacks can impact your suppliers as well. I mean, in some ways those aren't that different, are they?
Yeah, no, I think one of the ways to think about it, we can get real technical on targeted and non-targeted attacks and ransomware and wiperware, which are terms that we use. But I think we look at it, and I would encourage those of us on the call today is to really think about its business interruption. Ultimately, the thing that harms us is the business interruption elements of ransomware. Yes, it can cost money. Yes, it can cost damage. But ultimately, the cost to us is business interruption. And so with that in mind, the supply chain becomes more and more critical about where those elements of business interruption occur. And we saw from COVID that, not associated with cyber, but we did see in COVID with some of the employment challenges and supply chain challenges with regard to logistics, that there was a breakage in some of the supply chain. So I think all of the companies, particularly larger ones that have extensive supply chains such as ours, we have really started to undertake the fragility of the supply chain and looking towards where the breakage can occur. Now, the business interruption can occur relative to cyber because it appears to be the most prevalent, right? There's floods, there's hurricanes, there's other weather events, there's strikes, there's strife, there's war, there's all kinds of elements that interrupt business. But if you're gonna put your odds down on what would be the element or the event that would cause a business interruption, unfortunately, these days it appears to be a cyber event.
Yeah. So one of your suppliers or someone even further down the supply chain gets breached in regards to a program that you're involved in. Can they expect to get a knock on the door from BAE Systems?
Yeah, it depends. One of the things that we very much encourage our suppliers, if they do feel that they're under siege or have been the victim of attack, that they notify us. Sometimes that's required in the contracts when we have direct relationships. Sometimes it is not. So we learn about supplier breaches in three different ways. The first and most important to us is that the supplier says, "Hey, I think we got an issue." The second, and not quite as good, is that we have a partner or a government agency that advises us that there is a breach because it involves our data and involves potentially a program that we have some concerns over. And the third, of course, is you hear it through the grapevine, you hear it in a blog, or worse yet, you see it on the front lines of a newspaper article. So we do learn about the suppliers. So what happens when we do learn of that? And let's go with the best case, that we get a call from a contracting officer who says, "Hey, we believe this company is starting to, they've reached out to us. They think they're involved with a ransomware attack. What do we do next?" So I can just speak to what we do to give you a sense what's on the other side of the wall. And I don't think this is unique just to our company, but it'll give you a sense of what happens on the other side. First of all, thanks for giving us the heads up. But the first thing we're going to do is essentially, where are you in the breach? What's going on? We are going to assume the worst, right? So we're going to assume that the company's been breached. That includes their email, that includes their communications. So the first thing that we do is we block all communications from that company going into our network, right? We basically do a fast feed on if there's anybody that has email access, anybody has extranet access, all those avenues are blocked. With the assumption that if there is a vector of attack and one company has already got a virus or got a problem, we want to make sure it doesn't get in. So once we've isolated all the connectivity and quarantined any accounts from that contractor to include past emails, right? Because just because we got email on, we think there's ransomware on Wednesday doesn't mean it couldn't come in an email that's 2 weeks, 3 weeks back. So we quarantine all past accounts as well. That includes our backup logs, depending on how long the event goes. And then we do a quick run of all the contracts and programs that we have with that supplier, whether it's one contract, one program, or many contracts and many programs. So we get a kind of a situational awareness of what the implications might be if that contractor cannot get back online or that supplier cannot get back online in a reasonable amount of time. And then we initiate contact with the company directly, not through email because we may be compromised, but through telephone. And we've been kind of set up a bridge to help them and understand the situation that's going on. Also remind them of their reporting violations, obligations, I should say, right? Whether it be the DFARS requirements, whether it be privacy, depending on what the type of data is. But all of us have reporting requirements that we're obligated to follow. So we kind of make that as a reminder. We set up an alternatives communications channel if we have to and can. And then we recommend some possible crisis management or response partners. If we don't endorse them, but we offer out companies that we have worked with in the past that we essentially are knowledgeable of, that do good work. I can speak for us, touch on wood, we have not had significant events. And so if I'm going to have a bad event or I feel that there's a ransomware attack going on, I'm going to go to a company that cleans this up every day. And that's not us. And so we do openly admit that if we had a significant attack, we would go to an operation that knows how to do that and does it day in and day out. And then we would supplement our team with that expertise. After we get a read over time of what's going on with the company, then we begin to reconstitute the connectivity to gain some pace back to the business. And it may be alternate comms, there may be some other things that we can do to help. But the overall gain is to make sure that we are bringing connectivity back up at a very measured rate, commensurate with what we think the risk is of the breach. And then eventually we recover the secure business operations and we keep things going together.
Wow, a lot of work. So in addition to the data exfiltration concern, there's the work involved in this and the impact of the program potentially.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, think about it. If it's something as certainly as simple as billings and invoices, right? If I'm a small company and all of a sudden my connectivity is going to be cut off because I've got a cyber event, I won't be able to get my invoices out, which means my pay timing may suffer. So there's a lot of things that happen in that, which is why it's important to stay ahead. And there's a lot of capability out there. I think, the years have gone by when somebody says, I just don't know how to get in a secure environment. The Microsoft GCC High is now working off the shelf. Today's sponsor, PreVeil, have capability that there, and there's a list of another set of providers that can get you into a position where you can at least have communications, you can at least have some file sharing, and you can keep the businesses running. So it becomes more of a resiliency question in many ways, not just a cyber response question. I think that's the other evolving part of this is that, it's all about not only the cyber response, but it's also about the resiliency of how you take a punch and how you get back in the game.
Sure. Yeah. And systems that are just simply more resilient to those type of external attacks are going to be good. So if someone's breached, my guess is that in those situations, after you kind of get things under control, their actual compliance with DFARS, with NIST controls, et cetera, could be under the microscope. Is that the case? That is
exactly the case. That happens. And it's tough, right? Because at the first fact of the matter is that a company that is a victim of this is a victim of a crime. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that. So the first thing is, look, this is a victim company and that we should approach it as such. And I think people go into that as such. But when we start digging into it, and if the company that has been testing to the standards and controls, and it comes out that those controls have not been applied, they're not very accurate, it's an ineffective program, I do think there's exposure to those companies for at the very least to be second guessing by the next time they're going to come up for a contract. But there's also potential contractual remedies that are set up. And those include legal remedies. And so, I think we will see some of these things manifest themselves. But I think on the other side of the coin, if a company is trying to do the best that they can, and they have an honest effort, and they're showing some due diligence and reasonable efforts to pursue these controls, make sure they're operationally effective, which doesn't mean just installing them and let them go. Great points based on the talk before we started about, hey, you can't leave this stuff alone. You just don't turn the switch on and leave it alone. You've got to assure it. You've got to test it. You've got to make sure the configurations remain. But I think if you have companies that are giving that leaning forward, I think their reputation does stay intact. And I think they do have a good chance of coming out of it in a better position than they were. I get concerned about the companies and suppliers that aren't doing anything and are kind of throwing the dice, waiting for them to get a ransomware attack. And all of a sudden a ransomware attack comes. And the first three things on the checklist are do MFA. And you go in there and says, well, you don't use MFA. And you kind of go, well, that's a problem, right? And now I got a problem whether I should be using you for future business.
Plus, right. And plus, while you get the oversight from BAE Systems, if there is an incident that's been reported to the DoD, you also may be dealing directly with the DoD or DIVCAC groups in that as well.
Yeah, and it's a great point. I mean, for those who are fortunate not to have been gone through all this routine, but you know, it's once there is a breach and involves our customer's data, our customer in this case DoD for this example, there is a damage assessment process that goes on. So even though the breach has occurred and either data is missing or potentially destroyed from a ransomware or wiperware, in many cases, the government, under its contractual authorities, has the opportunity to come and say, let us take a look at what happened. And then a damage assessment may ensue, particularly if data is lost, or what has sometimes happened, ransomware is used to cover up a data theft, right? They lock everything up, but before they locked it up, they stole data. And those get pretty tricky. But the government customer wants to understand, as a result of a breach, what potential classified and unclassified information, I should say, classified is a different deal, but unclassified information, what is it that we think we may have lost out of our network that would have an adverse impact to some of the ongoing services and capabilities that the government's looking for?
Yeah. Okay. One last key area here, you know, specifically in regards to DFARS 7012 compliance, including NIST 800-171 controls, obviously the new CMMC 2.0 assessment process that's going to be associated with NIST 800-171 controls. What are BAE's expectations for any of your contractors in your supply chain that will be handling controlled unclassified information?
Yeah, I think the first and foremost is the most obvious to all of us, and that is that, you know, we're compliant with our contract, right? We're compliant with our quality standards, we're compliant with our service deliveries, the costs, and this is just another requirement that's critically important to be upheld and be maintained. So I think, you know, compliant networks is the first thing. I think the other thing that we like to look for, and this includes companies when we're looking at them for partnerships and so forth, is how have they set up their monitoring controls? In other words, again, we see some companies that will hire a firm, they'll get the controls on place, but then 60 days later, those controls have been misconfigured and all the efforts they put in place have kind of washed away. So we look for, you know, how are you going to monitor that? Or what's the assurance program that the supplier has to ensure that those controls, once they've done all the legwork and all the hard work gotten in place, how are they keeping it in place and how are they testing it? And I think the other element is that we expect transparency. If the customer is pushing down requirements, which they are, and they're moving and flowing down into the contractual change, then we want to have transparency, and we want to know a supplier if they have a problem, that they raise their hand and say, hey, I'm not sure I can do this right, I'm having trouble executing against some of these, just like I would on a quality problem, right? It's a team sport. Supply chain is critical to everything that we do, and transparency is a big deal. Another thing that has worked well for a lot of companies is this third-party assessment. And it's kind of interesting, the CMMC, you know, that's going to be an assessor, DIVCAC, right? That's an assessment. There's ISO 27001 and others, but sometimes a third-party assessment is very helpful in giving an upper tier supplier or a prime like ourselves some degree of confidence that they've got an institutionalized program there of cybersecurity. And then finally, some of it is just making sure the top capabilities that you have, even if you can't do every single thing in the requirement, if you can't, identify which areas are most critical to you and work with the primes and the upper tier contractors to say, I can do this, but I can't afford to do that, and figure out the ways that to work through that together. But kind of huddling up and pretending it's not going to happen to you is not a good successful business path forward.
Yeah, thanks. JC, when it comes to BAE's processes, you know, obviously you're trying to keep track of your suppliers and what compliance they meet or don't meet, et cetera. Is that an ongoing process to kind of maintain your sort of database, your knowledge base around which folks in your supply chain meet the certain qualifications or regulations?
We do. I mean, and right now I will tell you, we're doing self-attestation like many companies. What we are paying much more attention to, though, is those companies that are able to come forward and say, hey, I have had a good DIBCAC assessment. And not that is supposedly confidential information, and we respect that, but we like to hear from companies that have actually gone through an assessment, like I say, a third party, and that helps us get a better view of what we think the company is going to be able to do and where some of the risk might be. I think it's starting to get interesting now in things like teaming arrangements or new bids of when you're building your team up, and that's something that hasn't really manifested itself yet, but I'm seeing that more and more about, you know, hey, I've got 3 suppliers that I want to pick on this big bid. You know, how do I judge them from a cybersecurity perspective? And honestly, I've been involved in a couple where we have to sit down and look, and sometimes I'll go to a third party and say, hey, can you do a scan on these folks from the outside? And there's a lot of companies that can do scans on the outside. Some have noise in the system, so the accuracy is not always there. Others are becoming quite good about just doing external scans and being able to look at misconfigurations that are obvious. And then you kind of got to, you know, think back of whether that's a company we want to team up with.
Yeah. All right, JC, we're about done. I think there's one question I wanted to try and hit that's come in that I think is relevant to the conversation, particularly relevant to the conversation we've had. It's around incident reporting. And it's someone asking here, how can I ensure that my cloud service provider that I use can meet the DFARS 7012 incident reporting and media preservation requirements? I think these are sometimes known as clauses C through G.
Yeah.
And obviously this is an important aspect of the DFARS 7012 clause. You know, how should they approach ensuring that their cloud service provider that's handling the CUI meets that requirement?
Yeah, I think the easiest answer is that you've got to make sure you've got clarity in your contract agreement, right? And some of these are standard service agreements. I know these are big companies that are big providers, and they got kind of standard forms, and you don't have a lot of negotiating room. But that's an area that I think it's worth having specific discussions on, and getting clarity around that. And if there are problems like that, in some cases, you might need to bring it up to the government customer and kind of say, okay, how are you going to do it? In other words, I don't have to tell you as a supplier, but I will tell the government customer. But I think it is a very, very important conversation to have, to get a meeting in the minds.
Yep. No, thanks for clarifying on that. I know we at PreVeil take that very seriously. So
yeah. Okay,
very good. Well, JC, thank you so much for joining our summit today. This has been a really enjoyable session for me. I appreciate the opportunity to hear you.
Apologize for the voice, and hopefully you guys were able to pick up on it. It's a pleasure getting a chance to opine a bit with y'all today. Thanks.
No, it's been great, and I appreciate you hanging in there for the session. Given the voice, we could hear you very clearly. That was not a problem. So thanks again. I'm going to turn this back over to Orly so she can keep this moving forward.
Great.